Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. Today I'd like to discuss a very controversial idea within the cryptozoological field, not one shared by everyone, and certainly not one that is agreed to be valid as an idea by everyone, but one that tends to prevail throughout time nonetheless. I'm referring, of course, to the Gigantopithecus Sasquatch theory. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the theory roughly suggests that modern-day Sasquatch sightings may be attributed to surviving populations of a real prehistoric ape that we know existed, called Gigantopithecus. For a good deal of people, this is where the thought process may end. In this video, however, we're going to take a very in-depth dive into the information that we know about Gigantopithecus, what we might be able to infer, and how that may apply to Sasquatch sightings. The whole thing is more open-ended than either side tends to lead people to believe. The first fossils of Gigantopithecus were discovered in a region of China in the 1930s by Ron Koenigswald. Koenigswald was a traveling anthropologist who discovered that in many Chinese apothecaries there were these fossilized teeth being ground up into medicine. Upon examining the teeth, he found them to be the teeth of a very large primate, the likes of which we had not seen in the fossil record beforehand. The species was thusly named Gigantopithecus, due to its massive size. It would be several years before more fossils of Gigantopithecus were discovered, but when they were, we were able to gather very telling information. There were size variances between these fossils that were distinct enough to actually warrant 2 or 3 species, or perhaps subspecies is a better word, of Gigantopithecus. Currently, the 3 subspecies recognized are Gigantopithecus blacki, Gigantopithecus balasparensis, and Gigantopithecus giganteus. It is currently in debate whether or not balasparensis and giganteus are actually the same species. From what we can gather, based on location and the material that we have been able to gather from the fossils, Gigantopithecus was a very, very large ape. If it stood erect, it would be somewhere between 10 to 12 feet tall. Absolutely massive. Gigantopithecus lived in regions of Asia like India, Tibet, Vietnam, and China. Due to this recognized habitat, as well as enamel that we have actually been able to gather from the teeth of these Gigantopithecus fossils, we've been able to tell that they were mainly vegetarian, likely having to rely on bamboo to a considerable extent. We also know that Gigantopithecus existed between 9 million to about 100,000 years ago, and it certainly coexisted with humans at some point. It's very likely that humans saw Gigantopithecus from time to time. The most relevant matter of debate within the Gigantopithecus topic, as it relates to cryptozoology, is, was Gigantopithecus a quadruped or a biped? Did it walk on all fours and did it knuckle walk? Or did it stand erect like people and walk on 2 legs? Again, both sides would lead one to believe we have a definite answer for that. And quite frankly, the process just isn't that simple. The idea that Giganto may have been a biped was brought to light between the 1960s to the 1980s by anthropologist Grover Krantz. Grover Krantz had an absolute fascination with Sasquatch and believed it to be a real species of animal, and was the first person to really come up with the idea that Gigantopithecus and Sasquatch were the same species.
We have an awful lot of evidence that is taken to indicate that there is a large bipedal animal out there.
Grover Krantz is a professor of anthropology at Washington State University. He has been studying Bigfoot for over 20 years and is a world authority on cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals.
If this thing is real, this is extremely pertinent to my field. So I would be very unscientific to simply ignore something like this. If there is not an animal 6 to 8 feet tall, then you have to explain all this evidence with some other method or methods. And that becomes absolutely incredible and cumbersome, just impossible, really.
Krantz believes that Sasquatch are descendants of Gigantopithecus blacki, a long-extinct Southeast Asian gorilla that he feels migrated to North America via the Bering Straits land bridge.
This is what the Gigantopithecus skull would have looked like. Now, this, of course, makes a gorilla look decidedly small, and that's our comparison.
He even attempted to propose, scientifically and officially, the name Gigantopithecus blacki for the Sasquatch, However, it was rejected on the grounds that we were not sure that the Sasquatch was real, and the name, quite frankly, was already taken. Krantz would then go on to eventually posit a different name, Gigantopithecus canadensis. This was also rejected. The main reason that Grover Krantz gave for the confirmation of Gigantopithecus as a biped, and therefore a suitable candidate for the Sasquatch, was that the mandible of the Gigantopithecus, which we do have a few of, would suggest a shape of windpipe that is built more for bipeds than it is for quadrupeds. As previously stated, though, this is not a matter that can be deduced that simply. It's far more multifaceted than that. However, considering that the mandible is the fullest fossil we currently have of Gigantopithecus, perhaps Krantz was along the right track initially. When one examines the mandible of Gigantopithecus, there's something that would immediately strike. One might first notice that it's quite robust, it's quite large, but it's also quite sharp. It has a definite angle to it. Comparing the mandible angle of the Gigantopithecus to those of the gorilla and the orangutan, we find that they're actually quite within the same range. They all have a range of about 30 to 36 degrees, roughly speaking. Of course, the gorilla and the orangutan being mainly quadrupeds, this might have suggested that Gigantopithecus was, in fact, a quadruped. Further evidence of this might be examined in the fact that human mandibles, such as those found in Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, are quite more rounded out and wide, and tend to have a range of about 50 to 60 in their angle. However, there are holes in this idea. Upon further examination, we find there's a bit more of a gradience with mandible angle. For instance, the mandible of the chimpanzee is actually out of the range of the orangutan, Gigantopithecus, and the gorilla. Instead, we find that it's between 40 and 50 degrees, which is just about between the angles of the humans and the quadrupedal apes. In all likelihood, this can be attributed to the fact that chimpanzees are more built like humans than the gorillas or the orangutans are. However, it certainly opens the door that there might be exceptions to what we're perceiving as a rule. Upon further examination, we find that there's far more than exceptions. We find that there's probably not a rule in the first place. This can be exemplified by the mandible of Australopithecus anamensis, which was a human ancestor and a definite confirmed biped, which, although more rounded, is within the same angle range as Gigantopithecus. It does not seem that mandible angle can acutely determine whether an animal was a biped or a quadruped. That being said, one notable thing about the Gigantopithecus mandible that still remains is the extreme sharpness of the angle. Even in gorillas and orangutans, there's a more rounded tip to this mandible, but not so in Gigantopithecus. Potentially, this might say that the weight distribution across the mandible of Gigantopithecus was less efficient than those of gorillas and orangutans, and made the head hang lower. If this is the case, it's potentially then inferable that Giganto would have had to have been a quadruped to let its head hang more. Even this idea, though, ignores the fact that we know next to nothing about Gigantopithecus anatomy. For all we know, it had a very strong neck and spinal structure that would have allowed it to hold such a heavy head and mandible up bipedally. We simply don't know if it did or not. Although the mandibles might be a dead end, there are some other arguments that play into this topic. Perhaps the most significant is called phylogenetic bracketing. The process of phylogenetic bracketing involves taking a look at the tree of evolution, or perhaps really the winding bush of evolution, really, and looks to an animal's closest living or extinct relatives to infer the qualities that animal might have possessed. It is true that closest relatives of Gigantopithecus, still living or dead, tend to be quadrupedal. However, even in phylogenetic bracketing, there are holes. If we were to use the same process on human ancestors, and by extension therefore modern humans, we would have inferred that humans were and are quadrupeds, and that is clearly not the case. Unfortunately, while seems most reliable out of any of the options that we have before us, phylogenetic bracketing does tend to ignore the existence of anomalies, and perhaps then, by extension, the nature of evolution itself. There is also research that suggests that such a large animal would need to not be bipedal, because bipedal weight distribution simply could not well hold up that animal's weight. Outside of the context of cryptozoology, this is not exactly an unreasonable point. However, within the context of the undeniable fact that we are constantly finding new creatures, and by extension, the context of considering, even just considering, the possibility of an animal such as the Sasquatch, by definition, we are already considering in that case that a large mammal might be able to distribute its weight properly, if it is that large, bipedally. Within the context of cryptozoology, this point tends to be a bit moot. And that might be unproductive if it were not for the mounting evidence that something is going on. Speaking of North America as a topic in this discussion, we are then left with the only few definite things that we know about Gigantopithecus, one of which being its diet. Again, we know from tooth enamel and from location that they were vegetarians that fed off of Asian plants. If Gigantopithecus had at some point migrated across the Bering Land Bridge to North America, which is what Grover Krantz posited, its diet would need to change drastically because the plants here are not the same as the plants there. It would likely develop different teeth and perhaps even an entirely different digestive tract. There's also the fact that the climate differs quite a bit as well. We would at least be seeing behavioral changes in Gigantopithecus if it had crossed over to North America, and at most, we would be seeing anatomical differences as well. In conclusion, there's no definite answer for this theory. But more so, there's no definite answer as to whether or not Gigantopithecus was a biped or a quadruped. Phylogenetic bracketing, which is our best bet for guessing this, really, would suggest it was a quadruped. But we can't ignore the holes in that. It would be unscientific to do so. Both sides of the argument, at the extremes, tend to wish to lead people to believe that we do have a definite answer to this question. And quite simply, we don't. If we are to consider that there is such a species as the Sasquatch, we cannot yet rule out, or rule in, that they are closely related to descendants of Gigantopithecus. I understand that this is a quite controversial topic, and I'd like to know what all of you think about this. I'm sure there's information that I have not yet come across, especially with regards to Krantz's work, and I'd like to find out as much as I can about this. This is one of the more classic mysteries in paleontology, and I'm sure that, cryptozoology related or not, we all like an answer for it. And what better in lieu of an answer than fascinating discussion? That being said, until next time.